A few days ago on the program, we're talking about potentially good news with inflation being under control. So says the Reserve Bank. Well, at least it will be by the end of the year. Of course, there may be a little bit of a time lag as to when that's going to affect interest rates and prices at the supermarket and the general cost of living crisis, which continues. But is this sort of good news? And, well, potentially, is it even better news than we thought? Joining us on the program now is, senior analyst for the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit of the Salvation Army, Paul Barber. Paul, kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, Morena, it's good to be here. Thanks.
Now, in any financial crisis, any indication that inflation may be, if not under control, tracking in that direction, that seems like good news. I'm not an economist, of course, but I understand you think that things may be even better than that when it comes to inflation being under control.
Well, yes, I think I would even be making the bold call. I mean, that the government has already, at least the Reserve Bank's already reached the target they set themselves, which is having inflation within 1% to 3%. Because if you look at the last 6 months, the last 2 quarters, inflation has actually, and those quarterly inflation rates, has been below the target range. And if you put that into an annual perspective, that suggests we've already had a big slowdown in prices. And of course, that means if you keep pushing too hard on the reducing inflation space, you risk pushing the country further into recession. So now, I'm making that call that we're already there.
I mean, that's very good, although 2 quarters doesn't make the end of a recession, as it were. And as I mentioned in the introduction, okay, inflation's fine, interest rates are still up. They're not likely to turn the corner by the end of the year. And I haven't noticed massive reductions, real reductions in my supermarket costs recently. And I'm sure that the pressure hasn't let up in terms of people needing Salvation Army services.
Yeah, I guess that's why I'm making that statement, is that if you talk to the people in our services who are working in communities, it's really, really tough. Yeah. And their employment, their incomes are down. They're losing those extra hours, and they are definitely struggling. So the point I'm making really is probably enough damage has been done already. Let's try and move into a bit more of that damage control work instead of feeling we have to tough it out. And I guess what I'm pointing to is that within the inflation figure that we get announced, that headline, it breaks down into areas like food. And it is really striking that food prices have actually decreased in some areas like fruit and vegetables compared to a year ago. And the grocery foods are still increasing, so people are still facing increases. You're not seeing huge decreases, but that increase has slowed. And then there's some other sub-figures. If you look at the breakdown, you see some things where things have dropped quite substantially.
Yep.
Passenger transport fell by 10%.
Wow, this is even despite subsidies coming off for large sections of the population. Or is that not kicked in yet?
Yeah, that needs more scrutiny about what that means, because the other side of that is the private transport. I guess that's petrol costs and so on have gone up by almost 10%.
Okay.
And I guess the real areas that people have been feeling the pain are things like insurance up by 14%. Rates, they took a big bump in on average across all areas, about 10% in September last year. And the thing that really hits people, especially the low-income communities we're working with, is our rents, which are now, the rent inflation's at 4.7%, which is the highest it's been for a long, long time.
I mean, this is the
rents are not decreasing. So, the good news, that overall headline good news does have its pluses and minuses within it. And I guess that's kind of where I was trying to go there.
No, totally. And hey, we'll talk more about rent inflation in just a moment. But I mean, this is the problem with averages, isn't it, Paul? On average, things are fine. But hey, in this area, they're absolutely horrific. And this doesn't affect everybody equally. Yes. Some people are going to bear the impact of that more than others. But interested to get your thoughts on what the levers are. I mean, for some people, they say, well, the Reserve Bank's only got one lever. It's the OCR, and it's a bit of a blunt instrument. But what sort of levers has the government got? What policy changes should they be making if inflation is already achieving its targets. What needs to change to take some of the pressure off, especially for those that are doing it tough in our communities?
Yeah, well, I think that's the point trying to make, is that this is the time we've in some sort of mild recession already. Inflation looks like it is probably dropping into the range that it's want to be.
Yeah.
This is the time to really look at helping those who are struggling, and recognizing that that is not going to have a measurable impact on inflation.
Yeah.
We're seeing we're in a sort of time where we're hearing every day about new announcements of cuts in public service numbers, and that will feed across into unemployment figures.
Yeah.
That will, work down into communities. We need to be standing beside those who are losing employment now, because otherwise we will simply send ourselves on a spiral that we don't want to be on, that will drive things into more misery for more people. Now it's the time to get beside people with that financial assistance. That means looking at how our welfare system is working for those who are really struggling. Also, there's a lot of talk about moving people off their job seeker benefit into employment. Well, very challenging to do when unemployment's actually rising. So we're looking forward to having those conversations with both with politicians and with the officials and the communities that are most affected about, well, how can we do better at connecting people who are looking for work with work?
This is kind of the, well, at least theoretically, the binary toggle switch within the economy. Oh, great, we've got very low inflation, but the cost of that is higher unemployment, wanting to get the balance right between those two things. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the basics of it, I understand.
It is in one frame. If you keep your frame narrow, you talk about that trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And I've said many times that the cost of unemployment is worse than the cost of modest inflation. Obviously, excessive inflation nobody wants to see. So I think I would be suggesting we should really be considering where we want to set that baseline. At the moment, we seem to consider it acceptable to have a few 100,000 people unemployed to keep inflation low, which I don't believe is a good approach. And there are different ways of thinking about it.
Circling back to rent inflation, which, as you say, is much higher. The rents are going up much faster than the general inflation rate, and you and I have talked about this before. This is the one thing. If we could fix that, if everybody was in safe, secure, affordable housing, a lot of the other social problems that we face would be put into perspective. But with rent continuing to increase, there's been some new government policies around, encouraging more landlords to get involved, but also some changes to the rent environment with things like no-cause 90-day evictions. Pet bonds is another thing that people have been talking about. What other levers, what other things could the government do in the space of the rental market, as it were, to put some downward pressure on rent inflation, Paul?
The policies that have been announced are very much framed about trying to increase the supply of rental housing, working on some assumptions that somehow people are holding back from making their properties available for rent because they think they might get stuck with a tenant or something. Okay. I'm not sure that that's actually the case, because there are the number of rental properties has actually been growing faster in the last couple of years than it's risen for a long time. What would really help with rental affordability is some consideration about how we can moderate and set reasonable and fair rents in the private market. An obvious further assistance for people on low incomes is to actually build housing that is meant to be affordable for those on lower incomes. That's obviously social and community housing. And we're still waiting to see the level of commitment to deliver on promises made by the new government. They're reviewing Kaingora. They've talked in general, but we're waiting, I guess, for budget announcements. And we'll see, are they willing to commit to actually building the houses? And that's affecting, for instance, community housing providers who've got projects at the moment. They're not sure if they're going to be able to follow through them if if those commitments are kept. But beside that, you need that. Most people on lower incomes are renting, as I've said many times, are renting in the private market. So it's really important what happens for people renting in the lower end of the private market, the more affordable end. And again, you have to look at how you assist people with things like the accommodation supplement, how you help people get out of emergency housing, which is a real issue right now, and get into housing. And that will need to include landlords who are willing. I guess this comes into the space of what it means to take a risk on somebody. It means actually willing to commit to affordable rent and sticking with people who may be, facing a few challenges in life.
Yeah, and hey, we do need, of course, more rental housing stock. We need a lot more good landlords, though, that are going to be in it not just for a financial return in that space. Interested in your thoughts on pet bonds, because in some ways this already happens in that there's most rental properties don't allow pets at all, which means that landlords who allow pets can perhaps charge a bit of a premium for people that desperately want to have a cat or a dog or both on their property. Do you think it's a good idea, though, to have another avenue available for people with pets that are looking for rent, or is this just another way of landlords being able to gouge money for marks on the wallpaper?
Well, this is the announcements made this week about bringing in a pet bond, and it sounds like a good idea in some ways.
Yep.
And then you start looking at the detail, and you start to think, oh, okay, this is going to be this is quite challenging. First of all, it's not actually illegal at the moment under the current law to have a pet. So it's about landlords having clauses in rental agreements saying no pets, and then you have had numerous decisions in the tenancy tribunal that have said, well, it depends on the circumstances, and so landlords have asked for some clarity, and I guess tenants might wish for some clarity. The clarity being offered is that you pay an extra bond, and that there's the full costs of any perceived pet damage after leaving a tenancy could be charged to you. Instead of that being limited to the amount of the bond.
I understand there's also a policy which is saying that rent can't be unreasonably refused on the grounds of having a pet. That there's some new clauses around that area, but there's probably wiggle room in that, I imagine, Paul.
Yeah, what this includes is some clause about describing what is trying to define what's reasonable, what are the reasonable grounds for declining to have a pet, and that would be really helpful clarity regardless of whatever else is done. So it's like some law changes, we really have to look at this and have a think through it. But it's clearly acknowledged in the policy announcement. So this is going to make it tougher for low-income families with pets, because you're going to have to front up with not 4 weeks rent in advance, but 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And if you're paying a $600 a week rent, that's another $1,200 on top of the $4,200 you already need to pay.
Yeah.
So it's not going to help low-income renters, and those are the people I guess we're most concerned about in our analysis in these stories.
Well, hey, appreciate your insight on this one, and perhaps even with the good news of lower interest rates or lower inflation, at least at this stage, is still some work to be done, particularly with I suppose the idea of if there's lag, if there's a delay between one economic indicator being good and then things being positive, the people at the bottom of the on the bottom rungs, they're going to be waiting the longest to see the benefits of it all, I suppose. But hey, Paul, appreciate the work you do at the Salvation Army. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your time today.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.